So without further ado, I'm going to start with Carrie. Tell us a little bit about your work.
Oh, thank you. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, and I'm really pleased and honored to be here speaking with my colleagues here today. I was unable to attend this morning, although I just caught the tail end of the last panel, and I was very pleased to see a former colleague of mine speak there as well, Catherine Ainley. So I was sorry to miss that, but I'm happy to be here today. I am, as was already introduced, currently acting as Vice Dean of the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. And so my experience is mostly grounded in the academic institutional landscape as an organization. I am a white, cisgendered settler scholar who goes by the pronoun she, her. I am queer and disabled, and I bring much of that context with me. I'm also a parent. My son is here in the audience today. He had to come along because it is, of course, a weekend here, and that's part of the caregiving is also part of who we are and what we do.
Absolutely.
So as you heard, my research may be located in feminist activism, but my interest in anti-racist work in organization comes, of course, from a deep commitment of leaving a place better than how I found it. And I think that is really important. The work that I have done, building on the long history of work done by many people before me at the University of Alberta in the Faculty of Arts, people like my colleague who's now in Calgary, Dr. Melinda Smith. I have been very fortunate to walk in their footsteps and build on that. The work that I've been doing as EDI lead for the faculty the past 5 years has been focused on a couple of things, primarily on listening and learning. And that has a lot to do with having conversations, both large and small, with students, with faculty members, with staff members, with different equity-denied groups, and then, of course, also with different context and unit context. In my context, that's, of course, departments, the kinds of disciplines that shape who we are at the institution. And then from that learning and listening, forging conversations, being a connector, and finding, making space for individuals to have difficult conversations and do the kind of learning that is necessary for this work. A key piece is, of course, governance and policy. That is something that, as a leader at the University of Alberta, in order to do anti-racist work, it means we have to do better already from our policies. So that has been a key focus of my work, particularly changing how we hire and retain staff and faculty, who is in front of the classroom, who is teaching young Albertan students today, and ensuring that they have the space to remain here and to flourish and to make an impact. And then finally, working with colleagues to put together an equity plan to ensure that leaders are accountable. And I heard that a little bit at the tail end at the previous panel, the importance of accountability at the level of... I'll stop there.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Carrie. Dr. Charles?
Thank you very much. I'm a scientist. I'm a very passionate chemist looking into the air quality around us. Did my education back in Ghana, then got a scholarship to read my master's in the US. So after graduating, I had an option of either doing a PhD in the US or Canada. And as I had a young child at the time, and the US didn't allow my wife to work because she's on F2 visa, highly educated woman, staying at home. Through no fault of hers, couldn't work, and I couldn't bring myself to the point where I'm going to embark on a journey of about 6 years and see this woman stay at home for 6 years without working. So I decided to move to Canada, and that's the main reason why I moved. And I came to the U of C to study air quality, the air we breathe, the pollutants that make us sick. But what I specialized in is developing instruments using lasers to be able to measure these pollutants in real time. So in the process of that, I came up with some unique concepts, built them, got a couple of awards at conferences, and met people along the way. And right after graduation, a small company in Calgary who does emissions monitoring for the oil and gas industry said, "We've heard about you. We like what you're doing. Join us." So I joined them in 2015. And as a small company, they were committed to what I was bringing on board. And through the work we've done, I have 2 inventions for them now. We solved one of the biggest problems in air quality. Thank you. Where we're able to measure these pollutants more accurately. So I specialize in nitrogen dioxides. If you're excited about it, let's talk later. I'll talk you more. So, and during this process as well, I love to teach. I'm someone who loves to teach, share my ideas with people. So I was teaching at graduate classes, and I began noticing that there's a gap, where when I'm introduced to the class, that this is the teaching assistant for the semester, I see people's jaws and faces drop. Because I am standing on the other side and the students are there. They were not to see a black person standing in front of the class to teach. And I saw that from the US, and I saw that in Canada. So I began questioning myself, why? I've been told I have a bachelor's, I have a master's, I'm a PhD candidate at the time. Why should there be a facial drop when I'm introduced? So those questions began playing on my mind. Through the process as well, I realized that the TAs that were in the department, we are humans, right? We make mistakes. When people from different backgrounds make mistakes, obvious mistakes, like you overslept because the weather was too cold. So you got to lab maybe 2-3 minutes late. Or there's an instrument not functioning through no fault of yours, but maybe you didn't check that particular one before the day. They will report you to the coordinators. But then I noticed that consistently, those of us from, let me be very blunt here, from Africa, we were being reported to the head of department. Very consistently. I didn't know. I thought it was just me. Or then later on, when you start talking to other people, you realize that it is a consistent approach, and you get an email from the head of department to the programs coordinator who calls you to the office. So I confronted that issue. Said, I do not understand why. And I started giving very specific examples because I have facts, no more hearsays. And they looked into it and they admitted that you are right. Why would the students come to the boss or the department to report us when we are wrong? But all others, they are reported to the coordinators to deal with it at their level. So they acknowledge that, and how do you fix this? That's the question. How do you address it? And after school, joined the workforce and started talking to people. I realized that the best time to pick a conversation is actually after work, during beer sessions with colleagues, where you get to know people. Then you begin to hear them become vulnerable and talk about their fears. Where people opened up about their fears of you joining us. They've never worked with a black person before. This is the first time. And their concept of who somebody from Africa is, based on what they have been made to believe, it's not somebody who should be in that role where he's able to invent or even understand science. They're expecting to see the black person maybe always cleaning hotel rooms or doing menial jobs. That is what they have been wired to believe. And I said, yes. Explain myself. During my PhD, yes, I was a part-time worker at the university. I cleaned floors because I had to put food on the table for my kids. And I take pride in that. That does not mean that I am less human than anyone else. And I told them something that blew their mind. I said, do not ever underestimate the black people you see in Canada, because the Canadian immigration system filters and brings in only the best. And you all are witnesses to that. If you have a GPA less than 3.0, you're not entering Canada through school. Is that not true? That is very true. So how do you expect somebody with a very high IQ to come in and always remain at the bottom? That's never going to happen. This is a high caliber, high quality brain that will achieve when given the opportunity. So when you see blacks excelling in Canada, it is because your immigration system brought the best into the country. So you have to be ready for it. And they laughed. But it's the truth.
Yep.
It is the truth. So through all my work, I don't shy away from talking about who we are, what we bring to the table. I don't shy away from it. So that has led me to community leadership role. I serve on the Alberta Anti-Racism Board, where, Shafana, you witness to some of the hard decisions that we are even pushing government to implement, but you're not seeing any swift response. And sometimes I think it's also the same thing, fear of the unknown. If we implement all these changes, can that result in a backlash from the community? So leaders are also very careful, because issues of racism can also become political. So, but we are not stopping. We're bringing a conversation to the table. And we have realized also that don't expect to sit in your home and people will make decisions that will favor you. You need to be at the decision-making table to teach and advocate, so that policies that affect everybody will be reflective of the new society that we find ourselves. Because Canada 50 years ago is not Canada today, and it is changing. So we need to build a better place. Even if we don't benefit, our children will benefit. So that's my background. That's what I do professionally as a scientist, and my part-time, I volunteer and participate to ensure that our communities come together and we build a more inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you. And hang on to some of those thoughts, because I'm going to be asking you some tough questions about that. Dr. Linda.
Hi, mikadahi sa mawang gawadi o idi kami adim kumutua sanang no de tatao milay mita kita te igwawang kami nga no e fosi zondi musudu imusuda sembeodi. So I would like to say hi to everybody. The people that I come from have taught me that when you go somewhere, the first thing you do is you say thank you to the host and thank you to the people who are there to sit and listen to you. As mentioned, my name is Linda Congnetiman Pansa, and I didn't start using the Pansa until both my parents passed away, and my siblings kept telling me, you're not a Congnetiman, you're a Pansa. So to satisfy that side of family, I started hyphenating my name now. I was born and raised in Suriname, South America.
No.
It's a former Dutch colony. Dutch is my first language, followed by Surinamese. I come from 3 tribes. My dad belongs to the Samaka tribe, or Saramakans. My mom belongs to the Aluku and Pamaka tribe. The language I just spoke is my dad's language. What I do now my life has prepared me to get to this point. Currently, I'm the manager for the anti-racism program at the city of Calgary. So when I heard Charles' voice, I was like, that's one of the black leaders I invited for a conversation in Calgary not too long ago.
Absolutely.
After the death of Mr. Chuel
Correct.
in Calgary. If you talk to my parents, they'll tell you that from the minute I was born, I was a social worker. I would bring anybody home that needed support. I would reach out to support people. That's not to put myself as first, but just to show you how important it is to me to support community. My husband, myself, and my 2 children, we started a foundation, and it's called YEPI Foundation. And we support internationally Maroon people who are in Suriname, as well as people living in poverty in Canada. If you go online, you'll see some of the projects we're doing. It's really important for me for people to feel dignified, for people to feel safe. And right now, in the world, people from racialized background are not safe. For me, racism is a determinant of health. So rather than talking more about myself, if you want to hear more about me, just come and talk to me. I really want us to get started with the conversation so that we're using the time valuably.
Absolutely.
And so racism is a determinant of health. People are dying. And so aside from people dying, I've worked for a long time, 20 years in healthcare. People are getting ill. It's not just physical illness, but also mental well-being and mental illness. So it is I took the position not because I was looking for a job. In fact, I hate to say it, City of Calgary, if you're listening, I was recruited for the job. And I kept saying, I don't need a job. But my 2 children are born in Canada. And I have to be able to leave a better society for my grandchildren. So I'm doing this job. I'm involved in this because it's more to me than what I make. And I do make good money. But it's more to me than that. So I'll pause there to provide Roshana the
Awesome.
opportunity to ask us questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all 3 of you taking us along in your life journeys and sharing just a glimpse of experiences that has made you passionate about this conversation today. So really, really appreciate that you've taken that time. One of the comments that has come in that each of you has kind of touched on is, Carrie, you mentioned you want to leave a place better than how you found it. And I'm hearing that in each of your voices of you want a future that connects for future generations to come, for societies as a whole. When you think about the word racism and you think about the effects of racism from a societal perspective, as an individual that has seen it or experienced it, how do you connect that in from an institutional perspective so that you're able to identify it, not just see it, but identify it, and also look towards action to move it in a different direction?
Yeah.
So I'll ask each one of you. Maybe Carrie, I'll start with you and we'll keep going around.
Sure. I mean, I'd say when it comes to universities in our context in North America, they are white supremacist spaces, and they are built that way. It's not just about being colonial spaces, settler colonial spaces. They are white spaces, and that is the very foundation of racism. And I think that, because of that, and I would say institutional leaders, particularly university leaders who are very well educated, they are, of course, those people who are, making inventions and creating knowledge and communicating that knowledge to students. They become very uncomfortable when people say, this is a white space, this institution is white supremacist, because they associate white supremacy with neo-Nazism, and that is not the case. Every single structure and policy we have at the university needs to be interrogated for its whiteness and how it perpetuates and upholds whiteness. So I think that that's what I would say very specifically, because that is at the base of racism when it comes to institutions.
I think you thanks for the truth. It's hard to hear people speak the truth without fearing for their jobs or I mean, I'm at a point where we need to speak the truth, because there are institutions that specifically did not admit non-whites to study. It wasn't written, but it was the practice. Where, and I can give you an example. Like I have a gentleman, he graduated from the U of C. GPA 3.9, honestly, when you run it up to the third decimal, it's a 4.0. This kid applied to medical school across Canada for 5 consecutive years. He was never given the opportunity. He became so frustrated, he reached out to me. I said, do a master's program. So he did a master's program at the U of C, and right after the master's program, a company in California has offered him a job. This is a kid from childhood who will play with stethoscope. He wants to be a medical doctor. And he's brilliant at that. But he will not get the opportunity to become one in Canada. He's not the only one. If you interrogate well-to-do non-white parents in Canada, most of them take their kids outside Canada to train them for the medical professions. And afterwards, they bring them back to Canada to come and challenge the Canadian exams so they can practice. So it looks as if certain professions, certain institutions are designed for very specific race to be able to attend. And that brings, in the times when that was done, it was okay, because the society wasn't diverse. Everybody was white. So it never appeared as racist. Okay? But with a changing society where we have more people from different backgrounds coming into the same system, what I realize is that what becomes very easily accessible are programs that nobody wants. They become very easily accessible to immigrants. I hope you can all relate to what I'm saying. For instance, I got a scholarship to come read my PhD because they needed people to teach their undergraduate classes, because chemistry is hard. And people who are born and raised here want a soft life. They don't want the hard stuff. It is the truth. So they offered me a scholarship to come and study, so they can get the labor on top of that to teach. When it comes to working in a restaurant, hotels, who are recruited? Internationals. Because Canadians will not do those jobs. So they bring them in.
But we are Canadians.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes, because Canadians who have the opportunity, or if you give those jobs to Canadians, they wouldn't do it because there's a better opportunity for them. So they bring people from outside to come and occupy these positions. But when it comes to the competitive desired roles, where excellence, brilliance, intelligence is at play, that is when you see the blunt force of how these institutions are set up, where sometimes they even question you, has say your parent ever been a lawyer? Has your parent ever been a medical doctor? Trust me, the lawyers who came to Calgary challenged the exams, passed, but they couldn't get law firms to do, I think, ActaClaim or something. They could not get law firms to do that. So some of them have to move to northern Alberta, to Nunavut, to areas where it's easier to get access to these. But things are changing. Now we have black lawyers who are establishing law firms in Edmonton and Calgary who are opening their doors to new lawyers to come and article with them so they can qualify. So when you look at the high performing areas, this is where the main issue comes to bear. High performance, high paying jobs, lucrative positions. That is where we have the there's that crisscrossing and people are saying, no, you don't deserve to be here. You know, some few years ago, U of C, and is it U of C or U of A, I can recollect, intentionally made an effort to hire female professors because they realized that over the years, systemically, there were less and less and less female professors. It does not mean there are no qualified women to take those roles, but systemically, women were cut out. So they made an intentional effort that no, this got to change. The same way, mass society recognized that we are changing, the society is changing. So what used to be there 50, 70 years ago cannot hold anymore. And we must admit that first. And when we admit that, the next question is, how do we now make it better for everyone? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, admitting is such a critical part of that, part of being able to identify that a problem does exist.
Correct.
And so often growing up, for me coming to Canada, it was an opportunity to say, oh, well, there's so many more opportunities for me here. I don't feel that there's an issue. But until you actually see it happening, experience it happening, sometimes you're even in denial that it's happening.
Yeah.
You know, it's important to be able to identify from an institutional perspective
Correct.
that it's there and what that looks like. Dr. Linda, tell us about what your thoughts are there.
What was the question?
We've experienced racism from different aspects of individuals. How do we identify from an institutional perspective that there is racism, and what do you do about bringing that to the attention of the organization?
Thank you. So when you think about institutional racism, that's the more subtle way where policies and administration, such as in schools or some organizations, privileges white people above indigenous and racialized people. The one that is more difficult to attend to is systemic or structural racism. Because what that does, it's interwoven in the fabric, in the history, in everything from generations to generation. And that's the one we're unable to change and shift right away. A policy, a guideline, we can attend to. But the systemic structural pieces is hard. And how do you see it? You see it because people from racialized background cannot move up in organizations because the system wasn't made to serve them. People from indigenous or racialized background cannot be served properly in healthcare, cannot take some educational, just like medicine, to get into without a lot of difficulties. So I can continue to identify and say more, but it's the systemic, structural one that is the more dangerous one, because that's what, if we do not have the right strategy, can't attend to it. The individual racism, we can attend to that.
Correct.
Right? Institutional, internalized, those are all things all of us can work towards. But the structural, systemic one is what's harder, but the most important one to attend to.
Let's talk about some of these systemic structural impacts and acts, actually, I should say, acts of racism, because they've been embedded into institutions, and it's been embedded into how organizations continue to exist, if I may say so boldly, how institutions continue to exist for centuries. And so tell us about some examples of what systemic racism can include. And then let's, after that, talk about what are some ways where we can start to unpack and pull these barriers down for marginalized communities so that we have greater access and ability to succeed in society.
Thank you. Would you like me to start?
Please.
Awesome. So, some of the ways that systemic racism impacts indigenous and racialized people, if we look at even language, this morning was a classical example of how language can be used to oppress. And I'm talking about the reverse mentorship component. And what would have happened in the past is a statement like that would be made and no one would say anything. That is because in many ways organizations privileges white individuals so that indigenous people and racialized people are oppressed. That's what systemic racism does. That's one way. Your voice is taken away. Microaggressions are happening over and over and over. You have to change your name to be able to apply for a position. And if you want to change it back, it's impossible. Some you don't feel comfortable. Black women tell me they don't feel comfortable going with their natural hair to work, or even wear their clothing from their country of origin. You can't microwave your food at work because of the stench, people would say, that comes. So there are different ways, but the biggest thing for me is the fact that if you look at upper leadership, identify to me in an executive leadership and other types of leadership in the structure who is from a racialized background on those levels. And so systemic racism, that's how it impacts. Now, to attend to it, we have to be very strategic. It cannot just be about, oh, let's change this policy. You need to have data. You need to have data, not just from staff, but also from community. So with the City of Calgary right now, we have engaged 1,700 community people. This is the largest engagement period in Canada. And we heard what the community is saying in terms of what they're experiencing in systemic racism, in programs, services, and policies, to the point where young children can't go swimming because of the names that they have. So I know I'm going a bit over. I can continue on. Thank you. So those are some of the things. And on top of that, staff, employees not feeling safe to share about their lived and living experiences with racism, microaggression, discrimination, oppression. And what happens then is people start staying away from work. People will call in sick. People will go on sick leave because it's not just that it is in their heads. Physically, they start feeling it. So what it does is it manifests itself in the program, services, policies. Then it has an impact on people's well-being. At the beginning, I talked about racism as a determinant of health. And then we need to be able to attend to it with the same voices of people. And I'll pause, and we can go more in detail on how that can happen.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
And if I can share one quick story that really connects in with the data piece is that, you know, data and understanding demographics alone is not enough. It has to be able to tell a story.
Correct.
And so it really resonates to me. And one of the organizations that we worked with collected demographic data, but with that, we're able to connect in with specific questions on value, on belonging, on inclusivity, on ability to influence decisions, on all of these pieces. And one of the things that was found is to say, well, just race-based data itself doesn't tell you if there's a problem. It just tells you if there's representation.
Correct.
But when you have data to be able to say if an individual that identifies as Indigenous is feeling a sense of lack of respect in the organization, and that it's not just one person, but there's a group of folks that are feeling that, it tells you the story that there is an issue around that respect. And so 100% I do think that data is so critical, but it has to also tell that story of what is it about that data that we need to take a deeper dive into. So thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Charles.
I want to follow up on Doctor's comment. She made very powerful observation, and I want to thank you for setting the tone for that. I had wanted to bring it up. Do you know how hard it is for your resume to be tossed around about 6-7 times because of your last name? Don't underestimate that. It's very hard. Okay, very, very hard. I have 3 friends of mine. When we were final year, we're doing our own little investigation. Same qualification I have. Ghana, my undergraduate, Ghana, US, Canada. I just changed my name, changed my last name, and we're applying for jobs. Same resume, you apply for a job, and the one that I have changed my name to appear more white, we get invited for interview. This is a personal thing. If you doubt it, I want you to do that. Okay? I love experimenting. I'm a chemist. So sometimes do that. And then you will see, you will be shocked to see. There are friends who are from Ghana who have European last names. And they tell me that sometimes people are shocked when they show up for interviews and they realize that they are black. Thank you. That's Mr. Patrick Arthur. What shows that he's African? Nothing. So he shows up and you're like, what are you doing here? So you mentioned something about being able to deal with the individual racism, but guess what? It is the individuals that becomes a group. And when they become a group and they share the same values, then it moves into society. And then society will eventually share the same values. And guess where that goes? Then that moves into the corporate world. And then the corporate world shares the same values. And before you realize, the entire country shares the same values. So dealing with racism from the micro level, it's so crucial. When you get closer to people and they begin to open up to you, and they are blunt and they tell you what they have been taught to believe about other tribes as they are growing, it's quite scary. And I want to be a bit blunt here, pardon me. Racism is not one way. I don't want us to think that it's only Caucasians that are racist. Immigrants are equally racist. We need to recognize that. Because there are some jobs that you have immigrants as bosses, they would never hire anyone else apart from people from their tribe or country.
But that's not called racism, though.
Because they have learned the racist behavior in the culture they've lived in, and they're implementing that, thinking it's okay to do that, as a self-protection mechanism. Because they think that, well, at first it was dominated by this group of people. Today we have the opportunity. Let me bring only people from my area. Let us, as a societal protection. But that is some of the effects of learning how a society operates on minorities. I asked a friend who had visited Ghana, and he was so full of praise for their experience. Like, oh my goodness, in Ghana, you don't need to know somebody to make a friend. Like, people will meet you and they will ask you questions, come to our home, come and eat, and come and I said, yes. So when I come from Ghana to Canada, and I don't see that, I get a culture shock. That's the first thing. And I begin to ask myself, why is it that here people are not more open to dealing with me? Because back home, that is how we deal with people. You don't need to know somebody to drink a beer with a person. It's very easy. But that's a cultural thing. But you begin to realize that it's not just that it's different, you need to make friends to get there, but sometimes it's how the society is responding to some of these individualized perspectives about people from other places. I want to touch on taught behaviors and learned behaviors of generations. So if you've lived in a society for over 1,000 years, each generation will pass something onto the next generation. The next generation will pass something onto the other generation. And as that goes on, some things become very normal until you are prompted. And sometimes when you prompt people about racism, the first thing is defensiveness and the feel of guilt, right? Because sometimes it appears, Doc, it appears as if we are attacking Caucasians for being insensitive, but that is actually not what the issue is. Because there are people in the Caucasian society who are fantastic, who have learned and they have overcome their implicit biases and they're moving on. But there are others you will encounter more often who are not there yet. But the very moment you bring these sensitive topics up, even sometimes at work, when you raise some of these sensitive topics, people feel very uncomfortable and they begin to walk away thinking that you're trying to beat up on certain specific race about the problem. So lived experiences, learned behaviors through observation, how people have been treated, informs what a society does. Without knowing, they are impacting people negatively. And to just bring this part to a close, one thing that I have also noticed is that racism is so inbuilt to an extent that individuals who are disabled, mentally disabled individuals, who have autism and other things, they are not able to communicate any other way, but they can communicate about who they are looking down on. And if you can ask people who work in the disability industry, and they will tell you that somebody that they are supporting, okay, the individual they are supporting who needs their support, become even racist towards them. And they say very racist things to them. And some of them will even tell that I am white, so nothing will happen to me. Or I am this, so nothing will happen to me. Because it's something they've learned in the society that you have certain privileges that nothing will happen to you. And some of the stories I've heard is that when you have, even with the law enforcement agencies, how they will treat people with disability who have been racist towards others is very different from how they will treat another person.
My apologies, Dr. Charles, for having to cut you off. I do want to kind of give opportunities to others to ask questions.
Correct.
And so before I do, I just wanted to ask you, Carrie, any other thoughts in terms of acknowledging that systemic side of racism?
Yeah, maybe I'll just keep it short. I think something that both of my colleagues here have touched on, data. We were talking a little bit earlier about hiring and representation, but that's not enough. I mean, I think that's what we're getting at. And the University of Alberta has, as many institutions have, worked very hard at bringing more Indigenous faculty members, more Black faculty members through the door in sort of cohort hires. Mm-hmm. But what do you do once they get there? And I think that is a real challenge that we are dealing with now, recognizing that if our support structures, which are systemic, are not transformed, then we're not supporting the individuals we bring in to thrive. And I think that's a real piece, because a colleague, an Indigenous faculty member, for example, we've worked very hard in the Faculty of Arts to bring in nearly 5% Indigenous students now, which is a very large percentage of undergraduates. But we don't have that same percentage of faculty members. So what's happening to our faculty members? They are overwhelmingly supporting those students, building community, making safe spaces, and they are therefore struggling to thrive, not researching as much as they could, although that's not the case, but the labor, the expectations are so much higher. And so that trickles down to their careers. And their health and their well-being. So that's just one little example. Representation data is so important, but that's one piece of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really beautiful example that you shared, especially in terms of the additional, it's one thing to be able to be representative, but it's the other to have that shared value, the shared lived experiences that you can connect with the students on a whole other level. And it does weigh on the faculty to have to continue to take that deeper dive in understanding, though it's such a great opportunity as well to be able to learn more about the lived experiences of the students that they're supporting. Dr. Linda, did you have something that you wanted to add?
I just would feel bad if we don't attend to this. We have to be careful when we are on a platform, especially something that's being recorded and will stay for I don't know how long, with the language that we use. 100%. So in Canada, white people can discriminate. In the US, white people can discriminate. White people can be racist, can be racist. Other groups can discriminate against anybody. So it is important for us to use the language that applies, because that's how there are loopholes for a society to get different groups to be against each other. So I'm going to repeat this. White people can be racist. The systems are racist in Canada because they were built to benefit white settlers. Everybody else can discriminate against white people, against themselves as well. So just wanted to make sure we don't walk away with a misunderstanding.
Particularly because of the dominant race in
Correct.
the communities in which we live.
Dominance of power and economic values, those are the basic things for that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that clarification point. I appreciate that. I want to put it out there. Any thoughts, questions, things that you, burning issues? There's one in the corner there.
Can we just clarify that a little bit more because, oh, thanks. Hi. Great, awesome so far. Can we just clarify that last statement a little bit more, because I understand that on a systemic level, on an institutional level, but on an individual level, in fact, you can have minorities that are racist towards other minorities that might not be their own, in which case it is racism and not discrimination. So can we just clarify that if it's to the same race, discrimination, but if it's a Middle Eastern to another culture, in fact, it can be racism on an individual level.
The only reason it can be racism is if that group has the power in numbers and economics. And so I don't see another group other than white in Canada that can be that for me. So we need to go look at the meaning of what it means. So, for example, in Suriname, where I was born, the East Indian population is the majority. They can be racist against the rest. Why? About economic power, power in numbers. The other groups can discriminate. they don't have the economic power, they don't have the power in numbers.
It's something that I have had a personal discussion with in the past about racism. And when you look at the classic definitions of it, it's denying another race of privileges and opportunities just because they don't belong to your race. That's fundamentally what racism is. So as Doctor said, if you are in that power, that position of power, to be able to influence decisions, and you take a decision because that person does not belong to your race, it's racism. It doesn't matter whether you're white or black. So far as you have that authority to make that decision based on your power, and you make that decision because the person you're denying is not your race, that is racism. And so I will agree largely with you that when you come to Canada, because it's white dominant population, white people can be racist. The same way you can have non-whites also become racism, because I know there are very wealthy and very powerful groups in Canada who also have an opportunity of hiring people, and they can discriminate as well. So, and in that case, they are not discriminating among themselves. They are preventing you from getting a piece of that economic pie because of your race. And that is racism. And I think that is my understanding of where racism, that's why I did present that it can be both ways.
And I think from an academic perspective, we do use that definition. If I'm hearing correctly in terms of the question that was asked is, we as individuals often look at acts, and I'm using this word, acts of racism.
Mm-hmm.
And that can come in many different ways, whether it's a microaggression, whether it's an actual physical act of racism. Mm-hmm. As an individual, if I proceed on that act, why would that not be an act of racism? If I have a certain belief of a particular race and I act negatively towards that race, how is that not considered an act of racism if I'm not in that statue of power within the society that I live in? Is that?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, because of course I understand everything that's being said, but I do think it's really important to understand systemic, institutional, and individuals.
Correct.
And I'm
Yes.
just speaking from an individual standpoint, that in fact that can occur. Of course, institutional and systemic, we're talking about more power there, we're talking about policy structure.
Yep.
But individuals also have a lot of power,
Yep.
Especially in today's world with small businesses, for example, entrepreneurs. And so it can exist. And I'm more speaking on that individual level and just that clarity there.
Yeah.
So, thank you. And before we ask that question, I just want to validate how much time do we have left? 2 more minutes. So I would guess that this is the last question before we tie up. Okay, thank you.
I think this brings me back to a point that I had raised earlier, and that is the approach of race and racism from the understanding of colonialism, coloniality, and how we sustain it, and whiteness. Because would there be racism without whiteness attached to it? And when we think about colonialism and what it tried to perpetuate, and when we think about whiteness and trying to attach a lot of these concepts, say like we talked earlier about accents. When you try to judge somebody based on accents, we talked about what is maintained as higher, and so when I think about it as who were the colonialists, what kind of concepts were they trying to perpetuate? So when we sustain that, we talk about we are sustaining whiteness in terms of coloniality. So really, even when I am discriminating against another person from a different community, does it have its foundation still on whiteness?
Nope.
And I'm expecting some aspect of whiteness from them, or I consider, so for example, when I go back to Kenya, because I live in Canada, I am seen as being of a higher class. And it is because I am associated more with whiteness. You can do this, including something like eating with a fork and a knife. You have more aspects of whiteness. So when it comes to discrimination, it is that aspect. What are you more aligned towards? So even if I was discriminating somebody from my community, is it founded on, I think you're less than, but founded on whiteness?
Thank you. I can come hug you right now.
Any thoughts, comments?
No, that's exactly. So one of the things that I see happening in communities that are marginalized is the fact that we're unable to accept what whiteness does. And so when we start doing that, then we perpetuate the racism, and we perpetuate the language that's used, so that the oppression continues to stay, because those groups do the same thing with each other. But really, racism, every country you go to, the ideal is based on whiteness. So we have to talk about it the way it is, so we could attend to it. So really talking about, I'll pause there, sorry. I know Charles has a
To
question.
add to that before I ask the last question?
Oh, I just 100% agree, and thank you for that intervention, and absolutely. And I think it goes back to what you were speaking about before, and that is power and economics. And even if we think about sort of a smaller, more local example, whiteness is pervasive across the globe as holding power and holding economics. And I think it is very difficult to untangle ourselves from that, and we have to absolutely recognize that in thinking about the flows of racism. So thank
Gary.
you.
Patrick, you get the last word.
Okay, thank you for. Now, I just want to ask the panel, how do we address certain issues? Or I'm really happy that you talked about data, collecting data from the community is really key. But in this situation, what are we doing, or how will be the best approach to collect such data from the community? Because there are certain situations, like personally, as you said, with my name, usually when I go for, they get their resume, I get an interview. But as soon as you get in there, then the body language changes. The same way with even the non-profit work we are doing.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're recruiting volunteers, right? Somebody will send an email, oh, I want to volunteer. As soon as you send or reply and they see your picture as a black person, the next moment, no, he or she is occupied with something, she cannot do it again, right? So some of these little things, or somebody invite you for a meeting for sponsorship, as soon as you go and then they see that you are black, then their body language change. So some of these little things that happens, how do we address these kind of situations, and how do we help in the terms of data collection in the community? How do we help to do that?
Excellent question. How many hours do we have on that?
I think I'll touch on that, Patrick. In my bio, you saw that I did some work with the University of Lethbridge. Some students were undertaking their master's program, and they wanted to understand the mental health of immigrant men. And they were surprised when I gave the masters to the community. They started calling some of the community members, and they were collecting data from the ground, where people were very authentic and gave them their lived experiences. And one of the findings in one of the students' thesis was that immigrant men stay away from hospitals when they are sick because of their perception that they will not get the best treatment. That was quite revealing. Okay, so when you go into our data system, you realize that a lot of immigrant men will not even mention their sick. They try to go back to traditional medicine and get medication from home. And then, so this is a manifestation of perception and lived experiences. So when it comes to data collection, we need to make sure we're collecting data from the people who are impacted. It's very important. I always give the best example that when there's war going on, you have a guy who sits in New York, 17th floor, and they call the person the expert on Afghanistan war. The person does not know where Afghanistan is. They've never been there before. But the CNN will call that person to give expert opinion. Whilst the real experts are the people who are experiencing the blunt force of the issue in Afghanistan. They have to reach out to them. So it's about time we recognize that we need community champions. We need to get to the communities. We need to get to the people who are experiencing and going through the issues. Then the data that you collect, you know that that data could be actionable. You cannot build a policy for some people by assumption. You need to build a policy for people with real data, and they must be part of it so that when it comes to the implementation stage, it can be implemented well by them. Thank you.
Could I add something? Carrie, you want to go
No,
first?
please, you.
Okay. You brought a really good point forward as well. The community needs to be in the center. So, Patrick, there are two things that I think you would like us to attend. One, how do we ensure that the data collected reflects what people want? So the community needs to be the center. It has to be the community's voice. As much as you can, use community brokers. So the organization that wants the information should not be the one that whose needs are met, because it isn't the organization that goes through systemic racism. So that's one. The other point you brought forward is the fact that when you want volunteers to work with you, when they see you, they might not want to because of your skin color. I have a not-for-profit organization. I'm black, so is my husband. He's the vice president. He's the president, I'm the vice president. And so we have never, our board has always been filled. So aside from my husband and I being black, we have white people, other racialized groups as well, and our volunteer pool exists from community members. So what I would say with that is, I think it's continuing, having conversation, ensuring that those conversations are safe for you and for the people that you would like to attract, because it is a reality. For some people it isn't, but for me it is a reality that when I show up somewhere, I need to be prepared over 100%. Because if I'm not, two things can happen. I might not be invited again. The reason I'm still teaching at the university or I'm being asked to do other things is because I prepare 1,000 times over and over. And they call it black tax, they call it all kinds of ways, but that's one of the things. So it is possible, but it's hard work. And it's disappointing sometimes. But we can't stop because we have a purpose and we have a goal. One last thing. Years ago, I was invited at U of A to do a talk. And it was about the mental health of black youth. And Dr. Bacola, she does lots of research on black people in Alberta and their mental health. When I was finished speaking, a public figure from Edmonton came to me and said, "You're so passionate about what you spoke. You spoke with so much passion." And initially you would think, oh, that's such a great compliment. No, it wasn't a compliment. But he didn't realize that what he was saying wasn't a compliment. So I used those opportunities as a teachable moment. I will never walk away from a challenge. I will never walk away from something that seems like a compliment. I will never ask a question or not take the opportunity to challenge. So as we're doing this work, we need to realize that our mental well-being will be impacted, but never shy away from taking every moment you can as a teachable moment. Thank you.
Karen, last.
Oh, that was such a good note to end on. I don't know. I think we'll leave it there because I think that's perfect. Thank
Awesome.
you.
And I have some thoughts, so I'll talk to you after. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. A round of applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you.